Should we begin?
Yes.
Yeah, one. Okay. Pooja, are we good to go?
Yes, please.
Okay.
We are live.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this exclusive masterclass titled Unpacking and Repacking Masculinities, presented by the esteemed Dr. Harjant Gill. We're thrilled to have you join us today. Before that, I would kindly request everyone to switch on their cameras, keep their audios muted during the masterclass, and please post your queries on the chat box. We will take queries at the end of the session one by one. If you would like, please raise hands. You can ask your queries yourself by unmuting. This is only during the Q&A session. By the way, I'm Navan, Program Officer Gender at Population First. My pronouns are they, them. Let me introduce Mr. Yogesh Pawar, our Director at Population First. He has been a print, web, TV journalist for 30 years, a disc postgrad in medical and psychiatric social work. He briefly pursued martial and sexual counseling with Family Planning Association of India before going to work with Indian Express, Reddit.com, Elle, NDTV, and DNA from 1995 to 2019. While he has eclectically reported on everything from politics, crime, entertainment, sports, and environment, his forte has always been social and development issues and culture. He has extensively written on hunger, poverty, destitution, exclusion, discrimination, caste, gender, sexuality, performing arts, success stories of grit and determination, and cinema. A freelance journalist since May 2019, his bylines can be now found in The Quint, Caravan, Hindustan Times, Article 14, Al Jazeera, and Free Press Journal. When not chasing journalistic pursuits or fulfilling his role at Population First, Mr. Pawar is busy generating content such as scripts, books, and translation work. Over to you, Mr. Yogesh.
Okay. Thank you very much, Navan, for that introduction. Let me briefly introduce our esteemed guest today. Dr. Harjant Gill is a professor of anthropology at Towson University at Maryland in the US. His research examines the intersections of gender, sexuality, transnationality, and popular culture in India. An award-winning filmmaker, Professor Gill has made several ethnographic films which have screened at international film festivals and on television channels worldwide, including BBC, World News, Doordarshan, and PBS. His films include Roots of Love, which looks at the changing significance of hair and turban among Sikh men in India, Mardistan, or Macholand, which explores Indian manhood, focusing on issues of sexual violence, son preference, and homophobia, and Sent Away Boys, which examines how provincial communities across northern India are transformed by the exodus of young men giving up farming to seek a better life abroad. Professor Gill is also the recipient of the Point Foundation Scholarship, Fulbright Nehru Research Scholarship, American Institute of Indian Studies Performing Arts Fellowship, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars Career Enhancement. So we have over what one can really say erudition personified with us today. I'm sure everybody who's joining this class will benefit a lot from what he has to say. Over to you, Professor Gill.
Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me to. Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you, Navan, Ankita, and Population First for welcoming and inviting me to give this master class. I have to confess that I feel a little bit of, uncertain about giving this master class because I don't think of myself as a master in really anything, but I will endeavor to share all, my experience, knowledge, and everything that I've learned so far in this masterclass. So I do have a kind of some visual material to show you, and I'll begin there. So let me just, if you hang on with me just 1 second, I'm just gonna share my PowerPoint here. So as Yogesh said, my name is Harjant Gill, and I sorry, I think I got the wrong, hang on 1 second. Sorry about that. Just one second. Okay, here we go. Perfect. Okay. So as Yogesh mentioned, my name is Harjant Gill. I'm a professor of anthropology at Towson University in near Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And I live in Washington, D.C. My pronouns are he, him, his. And the project that I'm currently working on, which I'll talk about in this masterclass, is this new book that I'm in the process of completing, and the title of which is Coming of Age in Macho Land: Masculinity, Sexuality, Violence in Post-Conflict Indian Punjab. I'm also an ethnographic filmmaker. My work prior to writing this book has predominantly been in sort of the visual medium, and I use films as a way to explore these topics of gender, masculinity, patriarchy, and also transnational migration, right? And I'll go more into how the films and my research intersect. But I just want to say that all these films, as well as my writings, are available online. So if folks want to check out the documentaries or read some of the writings that I've written on the topic, you're welcome to do so. You can easily find them on YouTube and Vimeo, and as well as my website, which is just harjantgill.com. And I will be focusing, as I already said, on predominantly North Indian Punjabi masculinities, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is, and why that's sort of my focus. But before doing that, let me just quickly say that there is a kind of a body of scholars and scholarship that exists out there on Indian masculinities, and there are a lot of other scholars within India, abroad, who are writing on the topic of masculinities. And masculinity, as we all know, it's not just one thing. It varies very widely from region to region in India, as well as historically has varied very widely, just as gender has varied very widely. And also, when we think about how masculinity intersects with other sorts of categories of identification and classification, such as caste, religion, race. So I've actually just written an article. It's kind of like an annotated bibliography of sorts, called Identity, Masculinity, and India Identity, Masculinity, and Identity, which is in the Oxford Bibliographies, which actually surveys a lot of the literature. I don't want to say all the literature, but a lot of the literature that's been written by other scholars on the topic of Indian masculinities, from all over the country, from South India, North India. So you're welcome to, before I talk about my work, you're welcome to access that through my website, and I'll post the link to the article in my chat. Even though it's pay-gated online, you can click on the article through my website and download the PDF version of that, and check out some of the other scholars' work who have influenced and informed my work, as well as people whose work I'm in conversation with when I'm talking about North India and North Indian masculinity. So why Punjab, right? So the job of an anthropologist is really to, we're not necessarily journalists, even though we follow the same approach to research as many journalists do. But one of the jobs of the anthropologist is to really, focus, pick one place, one community, one locale, one culture, and go deep. So in this masterclass, I won't necessarily share with you, you know, data and statistics on gender equity in India, you know, which there's plenty of it out there. I'm sure you can find it very easily with a few Google searches. I won't talk too much broadly about masculinity across India. In fact, one of the things that anthropologists do is to resist making generalizations. Instead, I'll share with you about my research that I've been doing in Punjab since 2009, looking at Punjabi masculinity and looking at patriarchy and how it manifests itself into male privilege and power. And there are a few reasons for that, right? One, and the kind of research we do is called ethnographic research, you know, which means that you go to a place or community and you spend long periods of time. In anthropology, we refer to that as going deep, right? And the reason for that is because so much of it implicates my own personal life. I was born in Chandigarh. I spent the first 15 years of my life in India, in Chandigarh, growing up in Chandigarh. And I moved to the United States, to California with my family, you know, at the age of 15. And I spent the second part of my adolescence and post-adolescence in California before going on to move to DC to pursue my research. And so when I was growing up, I was very keenly aware. I grew up in a traditional Punjabi Sikh family, you know, with turban, with long hair, and I was very keenly aware of the fact that as a queer, although at that time I didn't really have access to language of queer and gay and bisexual and things like that, but I knew that I was different. And as a queer, gender non-conforming person, you know, normatively masculine person, I was quite aware of the fact that I somehow didn't measure up to all the Punjabi Sikh men in my family, in my community, you know, men who we sort of look towards as kind of these valorized figures, you know, that embodied dominant or exemplar masculinity, right? All these sort of heroic figures that we were presented with as we were growing up, you know, whether it was like Gobind Singh or Ranjit Singh, or even heroes of Bollywood and Punjabi cinema who were presented as, you know, as very masculine. And I should also say that I grew up in a Jat family, and you know, the dominant caste in Punjab, dominant caste family. And in addition to this expectation that as men you had to be very masculine, there was also an expectation that the way you performed your masculinity in some ways reflected on or also implicated your upper caste landed status, right? And I'll talk more about how masculinity and gender intersects with caste as I go along. And it's something that I've looked at very thoroughly within my own research. So from that point onwards, from childhood onwards, I was always, you know, wondering, what is it about, you know, these men that makes them these sort of heroic figures? What is it about these men that, you know, that I'm intimidated and in awe of, right? And that led to kind of a lifelong pursuit to understand the way in which masculinity, gender, sexuality, you know, all these things intersect in my culture and community. I should also say that, you know, even though Punjab is often referred to as a hyper-patriarchal society, I also grew up surrounded by very strong women. So, you know, when I was growing up, a big part of my childhood, my father was not around. He was living in the US at that time. So I was really raised by the women in my family. So from very early on, I developed a very strong kind of a feminist disposition or ethic. And that has continued on in my work, in my research. as I look at masculinities in India. So I approach my work as a feminist scholar, as a feminist man, and it's an identity that I claim very proudly, and it's something that I think that we should all embrace, this notion of being a feminist, and also for men to be feminists. I think something that we should celebrate. So I'll come back to that again. So needless to say, I went back to India, and I've been going back to India since the January of 2009 to go back and do my research. And so the work that you're going to hear about today is, and really what I'm going to tell you is our stories that I collected in my research, because I think in some ways, some of these stories really get at the nuance, at the kind of deeper level of how we make sense of how masculinity and patriarchy intersect, more so than just giving statistics, more so than just talking about, rates of, female feticide and things like that we already hear, a lot of the discourse we already hear in the media. So what I'm trying to do is to go deeper and try to really understand how men's lives are shaped by patriarchy and the expectations of masculinity. So the work that you are going to hear about today, these are stories that I've collected, some people whose lives I've followed over the course of 10 years, even longer now, right? And so over time, it's like peeling off layers of onions when you get to know people. You sort of understand, oh, maybe this is what it's about. And then you realize, no, it's actually about so much more. This person is not just what they present on the surface. Their lives are deeply shaped by X, Y, and Z reason. And in that process, I've also learned a lot about myself and my relationship to my family. And, most importantly, my relationship to my grandfather, with whom I spent a fair amount of time, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, in Chandigarh. After my family moved to the US, the person who was left behind was my grandfather and my grandmother. And my grandfather, who we refer to as our Papaji, was the embodiment of patriarchal masculinity in our family. He was the patriarch of the family, right? So what happened when his children left and he no longer could exercise control over their lives? So I'll talk more about that as well. And my own relationship, my own sort of very strained relationship with my grandfather, who I loved dearly, but also who infuriated me at various points. So I'll talk more about that. And I just want to give you a map of all the places where I've done research. And as you can see, this is kind of a map of central Punjab, and all the little stars is where it shows that I've spent time, all the villages and cities where I've spent time doing research for my project, okay? So the story, the book begins, with this story that I came across in 2019, right? This incident that occurred in this region called Moga, which is sort of the center of Punjab, right around here, very close to Ludhiana, and also maybe just a few kilometers from where the village that my grandfather comes from. In Punjabi we call it my dadke. So the story begins. The book begins with the story. There was a young man in this village called Nathuwala Garbi, and on August 2nd, 2019, which was, when I was actually just about to head back to India to start doing some research, one night, and this is a young man whose name is Sandeep. He grew up in a very privileged family. He was the only son, a landed family. Some of his relatives were living abroad. His parents, by all means, he was a very loving son and very, normal young man at the age of 27. One night, he decided to take a gun and shoot his entire family. He killed his entire family, his parents, his sister, his 4-year-old niece, his grandmother, and he tried to kill his grandfather as well, right? And then he killed himself, right? And the account that we know of that night, part of it comes from his grandfather, who was the only person who actually survived that night's kind of massacre that he engaged in, right? And that's him on the left-hand side, who I visited 2 years later after he had recovered and after the pandemic was over. So I got a chance to interview him. So by all means and by all accounts, Sandeep was a very, like normal young man. Again, no financial problems in the family, no strife, nothing. The reason why, and then he also left behind this fairly long suicide note at the end, written in red ink, in which he talks about the reason why he killed his entire family, right? And his grandfather substantiates that suicide note. The reason why he actually kills his entire family was because Sandeep did not want to get married, right? It wasn't a case in which where his parents were trying to get him married to somebody he didn't want to marry, but he just didn't want to get married. He wanted to live his life as a single man. He did not want to be forced into an institution of marriage. And his parents, for the longest time, pressured him, and finally, when he felt like he had no alternative, the only only outcome, or the only thing that he resolved to, was to destroy his entire family and then destroy himself, right? Now, Punjab is a very violent society. There's a history of violence that's ongoing. If you open the newspapers in Punjab today, you'll see all sorts of cases of gang violence. You'll see cases of patriarchal violence in the form of parents, fathers killing their daughters for dishonoring them. There's so-called honor killings, although I think we should talk about that in a kind of a problematic way, this notion of honor killings, and we can talk about that certainly later. However, a case like this, where it wasn't because of drugs, it wasn't because of property, it wasn't because of dispute over whom Sandeep loved and wanted to marry, it was because he did not want to marry, was an unusual one, right? And when this incident occurred, the incident was reported very widely in Punjabi media, for at least 2 days. It was like a sensational story, and all the news medias were, local news media as well as diasporic media, were reporting on this. And to me, what was quite interesting was that both the villagers and the surviving family members, as well as the police, could not comprehend why a young man, 20-year-old young man, would not want to get married, right? Why would he would opt out of the institution of marriage, right? And so as a result, there were a fair amount of speculation and gossip that sort of floated around. As you can see, one of these news media sources claimed that Sandeep was impotent, which there is no evidence of that. Somebody said, oh, he was addicted to drugs. Somebody claimed that he was jobless, even though he belonged to a family that had some 15, 17 acres of land. That's a lot of property in Punjab, and he was the only son of a very wealthy landed family. He was not jobless. His job was taking care of his family's property. But the news media could not come to terms with it, right? And even when I went back after 2 years to really interrogate this further, I was surprised by the kind of silence around this particular incident and kind of almost shame around this particular incident. Now, we don't know Sandeep's sexuality, like he did not say, oh, I'm engaging in this act of violence um, because I'm gay and my parents are forcing me into a heterosexual marriage, right? Like that was not the case. We don't know that. And I actually think that that almost does not matter in this case. To me, what's more intriguing and interesting is this idea that in a patriarchal society, in a hyper-patriarchal society where men have all the power, the one power that they do not have is deciding how they can choose to live their lives and who they can marry or whether to marry at all, right? He could not see, Sandeep could not see in this hyper-patriarchal society, which is supposed to have empowered him, he could not see an alternative or what Judith Butler calls a livable life, right? So in many ways, his act of violence, which implicated his entire family, right? Like it caused harm to his entire family, including himself, became sort of in his undoing. And that undoing was, as we know, and I did translate Sandeep's suicide note in full. It was a 19-page note, and I've put some quotes here from it. We know that it was because he felt that if he was to remain unmarried, he'd be seen as unmanly, right? His masculinity would be challenged, right? So that got me thinking, and this is something that I've been thinking about all along in my research, is that, so what does it mean to be a man in a Punjabi or Indian society, right? And is the ultimate rite of passage into manhood, is the ultimate determination of masculinity, predicated on participating in the institution of marriage? Is that predicated on participating in the institution of family, right? Can a man be a man and continue to live his life as an unmarried man, right? And it was interesting because, as I mentioned before, Sandeep comes from a village very close to my grandfather's village. He comes from a landed upper Jat caste family, and his story really resonated with me because there could have been an alternative world where, had my grandfather not left Golian Kala and moved to Chandigarh and joined the Indian British Army, one day I could have been, Sandeep, finding myself in a similar circumstance because I've chosen not to get married, right? And this is something that came up over and over again in doing my research in India. I identify as a queer man, I identify as a gay man, but I've deliberately chosen, to opt out of the institution of marriage. And when I went back to Chandigarh to start doing my research, one of the things that, was the source of constant consternation for my grandfather, one of the things that he constantly brought up, an issue that became a source of tension in our relationship, was my refusal to get married, right? Up until 2013, I was able to use the excuse of, oh, I'm a graduate student, still doing my research, I don't make any money, as a way to get out of it. But as soon as I finished my research and started teaching as a professor in a university, my grandfather took out a matrimonial ad for me to find me a girl in the Tribune newspaper. And this is that ad that you can see there on screen, without my consent, without my knowledge, right? And to him, it didn't matter. My educational or professional achievements almost didn't matter. They were secondary, right? It was more important that I fulfill that requirement. And I should also say that I have a twin brother, but because I was born 5 minutes before my twin, my grandfather is always referred to me, or my family is always referred to me as the elder brother. I'm the vadda pota is what the word in Punjabi we use. So he's often referred to me, and I'm the eldest grandson, quote unquote, eldest grandson in the family. So, in his estimation, because my father, who also is the elder brother, because he chose to migrate to the United States and disappoint him that way, in his estimation, I would be the next person to inherit his legacy and his property, right? And in Punjab, we practice what is called patrilineal inheritance, where not only the lineage, not only but also the property and kind of traditions are passed down from father to son, and not just from father to son, but from father to the eldest son. What we refer to in anthropology as primogeniture, right? And it's then the responsibility of the eldest son to then take on that role of the patriarch, the role of the patriarch of the family, right? Which means to provide for the entire family, look after the entire family, but also exercise control over their lives, right? And my grandfather wanted me, partly because I was the closest to him. I'd been the one who had been going back routinely. He wanted me to take on that role, right? And if we look at this, this matrimonial ad for a second, it's so instructive. It's so telling of the way in which not only Punjabis but also South Asians think about our identities, the way we think of our children, and how those identities understood, particularly when it comes to kinship and marriage and family, right? So in this ad, the first thing that's listed is not my qualifications, not my professional achievements, or what we call achieved status in anthropology, but the status that I inherited from him, which is of Jat, the upper dominant caste, and then Sikh, the religion that I inherited from my grandfather. And to him, it was really important that he saw that as more valuable than any of my other qualifications. In fact, I think if you read the ad, my citizenship status is secondary, and then third is my PhD in humanities. And it's interesting because when Yogesh introduced me, one of the first things he said was professor from United States. He didn't say a Jat Sikh professor from United States. So to me, I find this really fascinating, the way in which South Asians, families think about what are the kind of identity markers that are most important. So that led me to this question. This is something that I've been trying to grapple with for the past 10 years of my career, is what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to become a man, right? What does coming of age look like? What qualifies one to come of age? And even though in India and in Punjab, there are various rites and rituals that young boys undergo, particularly among Sikhs, you do what's called a turban-tying ceremony at the age of 13 or 14, which my brother and I both underwent, that signifies this sort of transition into post-adolescence or adult masculinity. Really, the ultimate, in my estimation, the ultimate rite of passage for most boys to become men is this participating in heterosexual arranged marriage, right? That is caste endogamous. You'd marry somebody who belongs to your own community or caste, and that, to me, then sort of speaks to the way in which both family, heterosexuality, caste upholds the patriarchal structure, right? That's how patriarchal structure, in many ways, in at least in Punjabi families, upheld. So how do we understand, patriarchy, and what does it mean to grow up in a hyper-patriarchal society? So in my recent research and writing, one of the things that I've tried to do is to conceptualize patriarchy almost as like, kind of like an upside down power structure. I'm not sure if these exist I'm sure they exist in India too, but it's what we call in the US, we call MLMs, multi-level marketing structures, or a Ponzi scheme, where some people who are at the top of the patriarchal power pyramid, who have all the power, often recruit other men into patriarchy with the promise of power and privilege and, exercising control. However, once you get into that patriarchal power structure, or when you get into that power pyramid, you often find that the kind of those promises of power and control that your parents or your grandparents, in this case, my papaji, was making to me, accompany with it a series of own limitations, lack of agency, inability to be able to marry the person that you want to, that you love, and have the kind of families that you want to have, right? So in many ways, patriarchy is, one can think of as kind of as a Ponzi scheme, right? Where there's a promise, there's a kind of outward promise of, you're empowered vis-a-vis, women and other younger men and men of lower caste or status. But with that comes a whole sets of its own responsibilities, right? So when I characterize India and Punjab as macho land, right? And I use the term, loosely, borrowed from sociologist Michael Kimmel's work on Guyland in the United States. I talk about Punjab as macho land or Mardistan. What I'm saying is that not only are young men in Punjab and in India are empowered and have lots of power and privilege, that power comes with it a whole set, a number of limitations, right? And a whole set of responsibilities, a whole set of constrictions, right? A whole set of expectations on how one is expected to perform that masculinity, right? A whole set of demands that one exercises a particular kinds of violence onto their children, their progeny, to keep them in control, right? One of the things about being in a position of power is that you can only maintain your position of power by exercising, physical control through violence, right? If you are in a position of power and you don't do that, somebody else will come around and challenge you for that position, right? So inherently built into patriarchy is this expectation that one has to maintain power and control. And we can think about patriarchy as similar to caste hierarchies in India. And I think in some ways the two work in tandem with each other. One of the reasons why the patriarchal structure remains so salient within Indian society is because we know that if we deconstruct patriarchal family, if we challenge patriarchal family, if we rethink patriarchal family, it will implicate caste hierarchies, right? If you let children make their own decisions about whom they're going to marry and how they're going to live their lives and what kind of relationship they're going to have, inevitably they're going to marry somebody of a different caste, right? Or a different community, right? And these are not issues necessarily, I mean, we can think about patriarchies around the world. Certainly, I've looked at patriarchy in the United States. The United States is a very patriarchal society. There's a lot of male violence, but it's different. It's different in the United States than it is in India. In the United States, patriarchy and patriarchal structures coincide with race and anxieties around interracial marriage. There's a long history of a prohibition on interracial marriage. In India, it's caste that patriarchy upholds, and caste needs patriarchy to sort of stay in place. So I think we cannot necessarily talk about deconstructing or reimagining and unpacking masculinities and patriarchy without investing in thinking about deconstructing caste and imagining our divestment from the caste system. Those two things go hand in hand, right? So the question then becomes is how do young men, men like Sandeep, men like me, other young men who I met in the course of my research, contend with patriarchy, right? Contend with patriarchal pressures and patriarchal family. Some do it by submitting to it, right? You sort of say, okay, I'm going to invest and fully give in and be part of the patriarchal structure. Some come undone by it, right? Sandeep is a good example of somebody who came undone by patriarchy. He could not conceive of his life within the patriarchal structure. So the only option, the only thing that he could do was exercise control over his life is to destroy himself, but also destroy everyone around him, right? And I think that's one of the things that we'll talk more about, how men enact violence within patriarchy, even if when that violence is against patriarchy, it's kind of violence that has far-reaching implications. It's projected outwards. It destroys everything. It's engaging in a kind of form of annihilation, right? And then the sort of third configuration that I look at in my research, which is more common, and I think that's something that I've benefited from, even though this is not a choice that I myself made, is this idea of migrating away from it, right? If you cannot see yourself in a kind of a life that you can live within India or within Punjab, maybe you leave and go somewhere where, perhaps you have more flexibility, or perhaps you have more freedom. So, one way in which transnational migration becomes part of my research is not necessarily asking, why are there so many young men migrating outside of Punjab? And I think most of you probably know, if you've done any work on Punjab, or if you know anything about Punjab, the biggest aspiration today in Punjabi culture, in Punjabi society, is to emigrate abroad, right? You talk to any young man across Punjab, they'll say, what is your dream? What is your hope? What is your aspiration? They'll say, I want to go to Canada. I want to go to the United States. I'll go to Doha, Qatar, I'll go to, Dubai. I do not want to live in India, right? So that's really curious, because if Punjab is such a hyper patriarchal society, if Punjab is supposedly a place where men have all the power, right? They have all they're in control. They're empowered vis-a-vis women and everybody else. Then why is it that these dominant caste men, these Jat Sikh men, why do they want to leave so badly, right? Why is their primary aspiration is to emigrate or to leave? And there's a kind of literature that explores transnational migration from Punjab from an economic standpoint. We can talk about that more. There's a literature from transnational migration from Punjab that explores it from kind of a political standpoint. Yes, Sikhs have been historically marginalized, and they were victims of state violence at one point, and there's a kind of a skepticism on the behalf of Sikh community of the Indian government, and they don't trust the Indian government, so they'd rather go abroad. But the argument that I make, or the kind of question that I unpack in my research, is how does transnational migration implicate gender, right? How does the movement of young men abroad, reform or reconfigure patriarchal structures back home in Punjab, but also how can we think about transnational migration or the impulse to leave as maybe a response to the patriarchal restrictions, as a response to macho land, right? Or the constrictions of macho land that young men grow up with. So before doing that, let me talk a little bit more about this idea of mardangi, right? I use the work of anthropologist Matthew Gutman, who looks at masculinity in Mexico, and he talks about the concept of machismo. Machismo is this performance of hypermasculinity or dominant masculinity, or what sociologists and masculinity scholars call hegemonic masculinity, right? And the equivalent of that in Punjabi society would be mardangi or mardani, right? And in fact, when we use the rhetoric of to be a mard, or what it means to be a mard, mard ko dard nahi hota, mardan di tarah act kar, the implication is that one is expected to perform a specific kind of hypermasculinity, right? A hegemonic masculinity. Mardangi is embodied by the man who's at the top of the power structure, or at the top of the patriarchal pyramid. Men like my papaji, right? My grandfather was always, the kind of truculent, angry, infuriated, difficult to please figure in our family. He maintained control over his family with an iron fist, right? Not only because he learned how to exercise such control because of his life spent in the Indian Armed Forces, but also he understood himself to be the embodiment of dominant masculinity, at least in Chandigarh. And so as a result, nothing happened within our family, within our household. We lived in a 3-story household in Chandigarh. Nobody could make any decisions without my grandfather's approval. Everybody had to, sort of acquiesce. Oh my God, I can't say that word. Acquiesce to my papaji's desires, right? And if he thought something to be inappropriate, or if he thought something to be, not correct, he would tell you, right? He controlled not only the finances of the household, but he also controlled, the careers and lives of his children. That is until both his sons, my father and my uncle, emigrated abroad, leaving him alone in his 3-story house. And that was when I would go back, that was a constant source of his consternation. He would always say, "Oh, your father and your uncle has failed me because they've abandoned me here and left me here in this big house that I built for you, and they did not appreciate what I had to give them," right? So that's the thing about hegemonic masculinity, that there's a constant need for appreciation within that. And so as a result, his relationship to both his sons as well as his daughters-in-law was quite strained. He did not have a good relationship, and he passed away in 2021 at the age of 98. He lived a very happy, long life, but up until the very last day of his life, he complained about being abandoned by his children, and how every child, including me, had disappointed him by not listening to him and not following his advice, right? And his dominion within Chandigarh didn't just exist within our family. It was also outside. He would sit in the evening, he would sort of park himself on the bench outside of our house, and he felt it was okay to, curse and call and insult and, any young woman or man that passed down our street, right? Like anyone in the neighborhood, he felt it was okay to police their behavior. It was okay to tell them how to dress, how to behave, what to do. And he did not hesitate at all in any way to use, casteist insults against people who were working in our family, or towards the maid, or towards, the bhaiyas and stuff. He spoke to everybody in a kind of a patronizing, diminutive manner. He made everybody feel small, and even to the point that the police in our neighborhood in Chandigarh would often stop by and and say, "Hi, Sardarji, kya ban raha hai? How are you?" And so they treated with a lot of deference, right? And sort of funny story that I talk about in my book is that in the 1990s, when we were growing up, the neighborhood children, young men who were in our neighborhood, grew so frustrated by my grandfather's incessant policing that when the movie Terminator came out, my neighbor nicknamed my grandfather the Turbinator, and that moniker sort of stuck. And for generations afterwards or years afterwards, he was often referred to as the Turbinator. And so we kind of lived in kind of a fear of my grandfather. So he exercised control through fear. And what I want to point out is that in patriarchy, not all men embody or occupy that position of hegemonic masculinity. Not all men, are positioned in that position of power. However, most men occupy a much more complicit position. Men like my father and my uncle, who are the beneficiaries of that power structure. So most men that you meet, even in Punjab, they themselves are not exercising that power over their family, or they themselves are not, insulting or calling bhanchod and machod and all those, using all these insults to make somebody feel small. Instead, they quietly benefit from the power structure. So even though not all men are hegemonically masculine, most men are complicit within that masculine structure. And often the person who's subjected to the most amount of violence, both verbal and physical violence, in the kind of power structure are men who are not normatively masculine, men who are feminine, men who are queer, or women, as well as people who are third gender individuals, right? And those are the ones who experience the violence of patriarchy the most, right? Violence is not an outcome or not a symptom of patriarchy. It's feature, right? It's through violence that patriarchal structures are maintained. It's through violence that patriarchal structures, patriarchal and caste hierarchies are enforced and reiterated. And, in India, we start experiencing this violence from very early on, from childhood on. I remember when I was growing up in India, it was perfectly fine and perfectly okay for, a teacher or an adult man in our neighborhood or a relative to slap you or punish you or exercise corporal violence onto you as a way of telling you that what you were doing is wrong, right? Here, I'm just sharing an image that a friend of mine sent me as a WhatsApp forward during the last Mother's Day. And again, you can sort of see all the kind of instruments of violence that, at least my generation of men as well as women are familiar with, all the things that we were beaten with at one point or another. So from very early on, the idea of becoming a man, especially in Punjabi society, is synonymous with enacting a particular kind of violence, right? This notion that banda banja, banda bana dange, these kind of discourses that implicates that we will beat the shit out of you if you don't start behaving properly. If you don't start behaving in a manner that you are expected as a man to behave, right? Even when it comes to something like drug addiction or recovery, one will find that in Punjab, the way in which we approach, addiction and recovery is through corporal violence. ਉਹ drug ਖਾਂਦਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਕਰ ਦੋ, ਉਹ ਆ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਕਰਨਾ, that the idea that corporal violence is what the and this is not something that's particularly Indian. We get, and we can talk more about this during the Q&A. We don't have time to get too much into it, but corporal violence is a kind of a residue of a particular kind of colonial violence that we experienced during the colonial period. It's a residue of a particular kind of colonial forms of learning. So that kind of corporality and how it implicates violence is something that we learned during the colonial period. So violence is something that is a feature of patriarchy. It's not its symptom. So if we want to talk about how do you end, sexual violence, how do you end physical violence, how do you end, caste violence or drug violence, particularly in Punjab, one of the things that we have to start thinking about, and I know that this is a much more conceptual and broader project, is to kind of think about divesting from patriarchy, to sort of say we're actually actively not going to be part of the patriarchal structure, right? In fact, I often hear the discourse of toxic masculinity, and even though it's a term that's become very zeitgeisty and it's become part of the discourse now, especially when we're talking about. I just finally sat down and watched the movie Animal yesterday, and I can talk more about that film. Even if you, we can talk about toxic masculinity, but there's a wonderful book by journalist Peggy Orenstein called Boys and Sex, in which she talks about how the term toxic masculinity is actually quite limiting, right? Toxic masculinity implies, that there's one bad apple in the basket of bad apples, and if we don't get rid of that bad apple, it's gonna spoil the entire bucket, right? That's not what we're dealing with here. It's the bucket or the container in which we exist that's flawed, that needs to be replaced, right? So toxic masculinity implies that you have kind of crossed over a certain threshold of toxicity from which there's no reproach or there's no reverse, right? You just behave in bad ways. And that's not the case. The reason why men enact different forms of violence, whether it's Sandeep destroying and killing his entire family, or whether it's young, privileged upper class white men in the United States going on these shooting rampages. We hear this all the time. That's quite a common feature now of American life. It's because of patriarchy. It's not because of toxic masculinity, right? It's because they entered into patriarchy. They were brought into patriarchal structure with the promise that they would have power and control over their own lives, as well as control over their other people's lives. And when they realized, when they entered that structure, when they entered the MLM, the multi-level marketing scheme, the Ponzi scheme that is patriarchy, that in fact, patriarchy does not give you that, right? Like patriarchy does not make you more powerful. It doesn't make you more wealthy. It doesn't make you more handsome. It doesn't make you, it does not give you control over other people's lives. That bill of goods that's sold is kind of an empty bill of goods. All it does is sort of, gives you the sense that you have power, but you don't. So the only way that young men contend with that is by acting or enacting extreme, egregious forms of violence, right? By killing themselves and killing everybody around them, right? By destroying themselves and destroying everybody around them, right? That's their kind of a response to the patriarchal limitations that they experience. At least that's how I see it, right? And you're welcome to argue with me against that. And we see that actually, if you watch the movie Animal carefully, you see that enacted in many ways, right? Animal is an infuriating movie because it's just not, as a filmmaker, I'll just say it's not a very well-made movie. It's sort of meandering. But the crux of the movie Animal is this young man who, what he wants more than anything else is patriarchal approval from his father, right? Because he, and the person that he's oppressed by his entire life is his father, right? And this is a story, this is the kind of story that I hear over and over again within the research that I do. This is a story that I hear all the time from young men. They say, मैं अपने प्यो दे गुठे दे थल्लों निकलना चाहना, right? I don't know if you understand my Punjabi there, but it's like the idea that I want to get out of my father's thumb. I don't want my father and my grandfather to define my life and my life choices. I want to have my own life choices, right? And if you watch the film Animal carefully, with that framework of patriarchy, you see that the only way in which Vijay, I think is his name, the way he can conceive himself is in relationship with his father, even though he's surrounded by lots of women who love him and give him a lot of affection. The only affection that he seeks is of his father, right? Because he's entirely invested in that patriarchal power structure, right? And he spends his entire life in the course of the film sort of rebelling, not kind of safeguarding that patriarchal structure, but also resisting against it. And I think, there's a real missed opportunity in the film. I think it would have been a much stronger film at the end had Vijay actually, killed his father in the end, right? The thing that he had, that had tied him and had him acting in a violent manner, the thing that was his love for his father. And in some ways, like, he destroys the thing, he constantly destroys things that he loves. So it would have made sense for him to actually kill his father. I think it would have been much stronger ending. Not that I'm trying to tell the filmmakers how to make their own film, but I think it would have been really fascinating if he had actually turned the gun on his father and destroyed him, right? And I was thinking about this because certainly men enact violence onto other men, whether it's engaging in this sort of form of widespread annihilation. They enact violence onto women in their lives. They enact violence on queer people, onto younger men. That's definitely true. But even women enact violence within patriarchy, right? I think one of the ways in which, and historian Greta Lerner talks about this, The Creation of Patriarchy is the book. She talks about this in a more detailed way. One of the ways in which the patriarchal structure is upheld is by getting women to invest in patriarchy as well, right? Women, particularly Punjabi women, are told that the only way you can be empowered, the only way you can become powerful, is vis-a-vis their investment into the patriarchal structure as mothers to sons, and then later on as mother-in-laws who exercise control and dominion over their daughters-in-law, right? So women become a very important part. They play a very important role in upholding the patriarchal structure. But often that role is in relationship to the men in their lives, right? So it's only by birthing, and we talk about so much incessantly about this idea of son preference and why this exists, and female feticide, and how that's a kind of a plague in Punjabi society. But a reason for that is because in a patriarchal society, in a patriarchal structure, women are only able to exercise control after they have sons, and upon other women in the family, right? Once they become sort of more powerful. And I also want to quickly refer to another really wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you watch it. It's called Joyland. It's a Pakistani film set in Pakistani Punjab. And what's interesting is that that's another Joyland. If you watch that side by side with Animal, it's a very different film. Two very different films, but dealing with the same patriarchal structure. I mean, like the story of the two families is almost identical. You have the patriarch, the rich patriarch in one family, and then the elderly patriarch who's disabled in the other family, you know, who exercise control over his entire family, right? And so the entire film Joyland is about this young man Haider trying to get out of and to live a life that's not defined by what his father wants him to do, right? To live a kind of life that is broken free of the expectations of patriarchal expectations. So the film is so much about this kind of tension between Haider and his father and how it implicates the women in their family. And we see that the way in which women, in this case, women who are not powerful, which includes Haider's wife, Mumtaz, the way in which Mumtaz deals with that is by enacting violence onto herself, right? So again, this is a really key point that I talk about in my work, that men, when they're frustrated and they're frustrated and limited by patriarchy, they enact violence onto others. They sort of project violence outwards. They destroy themselves. Sandeep will kill himself and kill his entire family. Women will direct that violence inwards, right? Women will kill themselves. They will destroy themselves, right? So that to us kind of tells you the way in which women and men's lives are different and defined through patriarchy. But one of the key things that we have to acknowledge is that in patriarchy, violence is the norm. It's not an exception. It is the way through which patriarchal structures stay in place. Whether we're talking about patriarchal structures on the level of family, whether we're talking about patriarchal structure on the level of community, whether we're talking about patriarchal structure on the level of religion and religious community, or for that matter, patriarchal structures on the level of nation, right? So the idea of being a kind of a despotic leader of a country, whether it's Trump or Putin, and increasingly, Modi ji, you have to exercise dominance. There's an expectation that you have to exercise dominance and violence onto other people to show that you are in a position of control and to prevent other people from challenging from that position of control, right? And it's no coincidence that we're seeing with this current government who's engaging in more extrajudicial killings, whether they're at home or abroad, and engaging in more day-to-day violence and enabling more day-to-day violence, whether it's through rhetoric or actually, in actuality, right? And Punjab offers a very interesting kind of case study for this because Punjab has a very long history of violence that has been contended. I call Punjab a post-conflict society because it is a society that has dealt with various forms of violence, state violence, political violence, religious violence, national violence, corporate violence, economic, environmental violence, right, over the course of past 60 years. And how does that shape your sense of masculinity when you grow up being told that the only way to become a man and the only way you learn to become a man is through violence, whether it's you're subjected to it or whether you are surrounded by it. And that's something that I grew up with when I was growing up in Chandigarh. It was during the militancy. It was sort of the tail end of the militancy, but we were very, very, very carefully aware of the violence that was lurking not far away, right? And I remember when Beyant Singh was assassinated in Chandigarh in 1994 or 1995. I can't exactly remember now. How it felt that violence felt very visceral. I remember being terrified of hearing the noise of bullet motorcycle, right? Because you'd hear that bullet motorcycle. The militants use the bullet motorcycle to engage in extrajudicial killings, and and shootouts and bombings, right? And so anthropologist Radhika Chopra, who's at Delhi University, writes about this in more detail, and also talks about it in my film, Send Away Boys. You know, in Punjab, the sort of notion of masculinity is slightly different because Punjabi masculinity is simultaneously, because of this history of violence, Punjabi masculinity is simultaneously produced as threatened and threatening, right? So it's threatening, it's seen as threatening because, you know, you've got these, this kind of notion of these men engaging in political violence and, you know, even now gang violence and drug violence. So you're sort of scared, but at the same time, the young men themselves are threatened subject because they are subjected to state violence. And we know that that's another form of patriarchal violence. When KPS Gill was brought in to control and solve the Punjab problem, he exercised a particular kind of patriarchal violence onto the state, you know, and killed lots of young men as a way to kind of bring people under control, right? So again, violence becomes a way to kind of exercising control. Simultaneously, I just want to do a quick time check. How much more time do I have?
Well, we do have some time, Professor Gill.
Okay.
It is 19. It's 7:15. So we have 15 minutes more, and then you will have to take questions.
Okay.
So where once you are done with your talk and you're ready to take questions, please let us know so that we'll be able to
Great.
start sending questions to you.
Perfect. I will wrap up my talk in 15 minutes. And thank you for that time check, because I tend to lose track of time sometimes when I'm when I'm presenting, and that's not good. So let me, so simultaneously, you know, I think one of the things to me what was quite surprising when I moved to the United States, you know, and started high school, eighth grade, ninth grade in the United States, and sort of started learning how young men learn to become men in the United States. What was to me was very interesting was that the way in which coming of age or the process of producing masculinity is quite different in North America than it is in North India, right? In India or in Punjab, you know, men come of age in very homosocial spaces because of this hyperpatriarchy, because of the kind of limitations of hyperpatriarchy. Men are not necessarily allowed to engage with or interact with you know, they're not allowed to interact with women of their age, right? There's a kind of expectation that you would not, you know, engage in any physical relationships with other women until you get married, right? That you're supposed to, you know, discourage your children from premarital sex. And and so as a result, men come of age in these very sort of strong homosocial spaces where there's lots of men and there's a lot of male bonding and there's lots of male intimacy and there's lots of male love, you know? That's different in the US. In the United States, I found that actually, you know, coming of age or becoming a man, and there's a wonderful book by a sociologist named C.J. Pascal. The title of the book is Dude, You're a Fag. That does a very good job of talking about this. So if you're interested, you can look at that more carefully. But in the United States, you know, coming of age or becoming a man implies that you're constantly, you know, performing heterosexual masculinity, or you're performing, you know, compulsive, what she calls compulsive heterosexuality, right? So because men and women are sort of share their lives, masculinity is produced in opposition, in kind of a direct opposition to women, not in their absence, right? So young men, you know, one of the ways in which American men sort of perform masculinity is by belittling other men, other men of their age, right? And by sort of what we call engaging in this kind of a male posturing, what Trump calls locker room talk, right? This idea that like, oh, I hit that and I did this and I want to have, I want to have sex, not even make love. Like I want to have sex with this girl and I want to, I desire this girl and I'm watching this porn. So men come of age, and as simultaneously, there's a kind of expectation that you would repudiate any kind of homosexual or queer sexuality. So men come of age, through these sort of dual discourses of heterosexual performance of heterosexuality, compulsive heterosexuality, but they also come of age through the performance of homophobic repudiation. And I unfortunately had to confront that, because when I moved to the United States at the age of 15, and very shortly after that came out as gay, I sort of finally had this language to define who I am. And very, very early on, I thought, oh, this is great. Like, this is a term that I now know and I can use to kind of categorize who I am and categorize and understand my desire. When I came out as gay, I face a lot of homophobic violence, a lot of homophobic taunting in my high school. It was not easy. And even now, things have changed a little bit, but there's still a lot of homophobia. This kind of, and as a result, young men, when they're coming of age in the US, they're not intimate with each other. They don't share their personal lives with each other. They don't share their their deepest longings with each other. They keep each other on an arm's length. You'll rarely see two men holding hand, hugging each other. No way, almost never happens. At least when I was coming of age in high school, in the early aughts, you would never see that. And if you'd see two men hugging each other, other men would insult them and call them gay or fag and things like that. So in India, however, in Punjab, because prior to this, there isn't this specter of being labeled gay, and because men come of age really away from family, away from the women, away from society, in their own sort of homosocial space, there's a lot of intimacy. There's a lot of sharing of dukh sukh, right? Young Punjabi men, in my research, I found that they often, for the first time, they lose their virginity, with sex workers. Most of them, either their first sexual experiences with a sex worker, or their first sexual experiences with each other, with other men in their community or their friendship circle. So even when they have sex with sex workers, it's a kind of a communal experience. A bunch of men will say, okay, let's all pool our pocket money together, and then this time it's your turn, and next time it'll be your turn, and then it's going to be your turn, and then we can all kind of share our experiences and share what we experience, and take notes, and see who lasts the longest, or who had the most fun. So in that way, the sort of coming of age, while young men learn to become men through constant violence on one hand, on the other hand, young men also learn to be men through male intimacy. So the strongest relationships that young men, in India, in Punjab, cultivate with are other young men, right? They don't even share as much about their lives with their wives, many of whom are strangers to them until they get married, until after marriage. But often it's their best friend, or it's what in Punjabi we call jigri yar, which means the friend of the liver. It's with your jigri yar that you share your entire life. You share your dukh sukh, you share your frustrations with your family, you share your your frustrations with your parents. So it's really that male fraternity in which young men come of age. So that's kind of what's interesting about, and I should also say simultaneously that there's a lot of violence there as well, right? Because there is not availability of women, often younger men, and there's a wonderful new Punjabi film called Juggi that came out a few years ago that you can check out. It's available on Vimeo. A lot of young men are subjected to sexual violence by other older men, right? Now, this is not the kind of like, I'm going to rape you to teach a lesson type of violence. It's not the kind of the caste form of sexual violence. It's the, you're not normatively masculine, or you seem weaker, so I'm going to exercise and I'm going to have sex with you to for my own sexual gratification, right? So young men come of age simultaneously with this male intimacy, but also there's sexual violence, there's rape, and unfortunately, in Indian society, particularly now with the change of the legal laws, the shift from the IPC to the new legal structure that has been introduced by the current government, there isn't any real way to prosecute and talk about male on male violence or male rape, right? We severely lack the ability to talk about male rape in Punjabi society, or in Indian society for that matter. We severely lack the ability to, up until recently, male rape was categorized as sodomy, which is the same category that we gave to consensual homosexual sex between two men, right? So, even now, that category of sodomy doesn't even apply. So there's not really any way to prosecute and deal with male sexual violence, which is rampant. It happens all the time. It happens, and it produces the kind of aggrieved masculinity, that then we can see leads to young men acting in very, very violent ways, right? And that's something that our society has not talked about or does not deal with properly. And this film, Juggi, even though the ending, in my opinion, is problematic, I think it's worth watching because it sort of opens that conversation and acknowledges male sexual violence that takes place when young men come of age, right? So on one hand, young men are incredibly tender and loving towards each other. On another hand, there's this violence, the storyline of violence or the threat of violence that runs throughout the process through which young men learn to become men, and also young men learn to become sexually active or realize their sexuality, right? And so the kind of third iteration or the third part of my research looks at so what happens, first of all, as I already posed this question, given that Punjab is a society that privileges dominant caste men, why are young Punjabi men so eager to leave Punjab and migrate abroad, right? This is a kind of the kind of conundrum or the juggernaut that my research deals with. Of course, somebody will say, oh, because there are no opportunities in Punjab. That's not true, because a lot of these young men who are moving abroad, they come from landed families. They can easily give their land on Teka. Many of them have so much land that they can give their land on Teka. They can sit at home and eat from that. Live a fairly decent life, right? Punjab is not that economically depressed as other regions of India, particularly other agrarian regions. Even though there's an agrarian collapse and agriculture is in decline, there's a kind of story of agrarian collapse that goes on, that has led up to the recent farmer protest. Still life in Punjab is fairly okay compared to other parts of the country, right? And no, it's and also many young men, who come from rural Punjab who go abroad, they're not going into high-paying jobs. They're not going into satisfying careers. many of them are going to be doing labor, right? When they go abroad, they are going to be working as itinerant labor where there's a lot of exploitation, there's a lot of abuse. There's no welfare. There's no, social security. There's no safety net. So their circumstances are significantly worse when they get to Canada and the United States. Yet there's an impulse to leave, right? And again, this is a WhatsApp forward that somebody sent me, and in many ways, it kind of reminds me of the. It says in Punjabi, it says Canada, Canada, aa jao Canada, aa jao. Hum bhi tusi kithe jana hai, you know. So it actually, in many ways, reminds me of the image that we see from the partition here of the train full of Punjabis, going from Pakistan, Punjab to Indian Punjab. This notion that the state is no longer sustainable, and therefore it's better to leave. It's better to just abscond and leave, even if it's through illegal means, right? So my film Sent Away Boys looks at that portion of it more carefully, right? And of course, the other sort of story, the narrative that you hear around transnational male migration from Punjab is that of political persecution and what happened in the 1980s, and it's ongoing, and the young men don't necessarily feel safe. Sikhs and Sikh families don't necessarily feel safe in India. They don't really trust that the Indian government can sort of uh, can provide them with security, right? And that's valid. But my work in my research, I look at actually, for many young men, the third factor of moving abroad or going away implicates patriarchy, implicates this notion of wanting to move away from patriarchy, not necessarily so that they can go and marry whomever they want to, but so that even for a period of time, they can live more independent lives, right? This is also the kind of configuration, or this is also the justification that played a role in my father's decision to leave India. Even though he left after the riots in Delhi, he was there in 1984, and afterwards he left. He didn't really feel safe in this country. Part of his calculus to move abroad was to feel like that he wants his own life that's not defined by my grandfather, my papaji, that's free of his authority, right? And so I look in my research, I look at not only how the decisions that young men make about migrating abroad or even migrating to the city. That's true for other regions of India, but also when that migration happens, how it places other men who are left behind into a state of crisis, right? Remember, I talked about how young men come of age in these very intimate homosocial settings, really, sharing their lives with each other. So when your best friend leaves, and oftentimes these migrations are quite covert, they don't really talk about them, and people will say, oh, you only learn that your best friend is leaving when they take a selfie in front of the Delhi Airport International Departures Terminal, and they post it on social media, and that creates this tremendous sense of anxiety and crises in the lives of people who are left behind, because the person that you deeply loved, the person that you cared for so deeply, the person that you shared all your life with is suddenly gone. So what does that mean? What does that mean for your life? What are you going to do? And as a result, you see many young men kind of going through this existential crisis, turning to drugs and alcohol. Yeah, I realize that we're
Yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I was just
fine.
wondering how to worm my way
Yeah.
into stopping you mid
Absolutely. I'm
sentence.
glad you did that. So let me just
Basically,
go
because we will then this will eat into the timing for our question and answers, and I will like you to catch your breath a bit, and I'll quickly in between tell all those who are joining us for this masterclass that a little about our organization and about the idea of this masterclass. Population First was first registered in March 2002 by Bobby Sista, the doyen of advertising industry in India, and to leverage communication and media influence to address the social and demographical issues in the country. And we have always believed that population first, that numbers are not the issue, but the unequal social development and gendered mindsets are responsible for poor social demographic indices, be it maternal and child mortality, or child marriages, or the falling sex ratios. So, Population First was always focused on gendered mindsets, which undermine the value of girls and women, promote discrimination against them, and justify gender based violence. The challenge is to change those mindsets. These masterclasses are one way in which we are trying to do this. We get experts from renowned disciplines. In the past, we have had P. Sainath, the renowned development journalist. We've had Vandana Shiva, um, a great eco-feminist, all these people, and like we have Dr. Harjant Gill, who has joined us today. These masterclasses are a way of trying to shine the torch on the ways in which we can mitigate these gendered mindsets which are holding us back. What can we do to ensure that we become a little more sensitive in the way we navigate the spaces around us? So, to look at all those issues, and from a specialized point of view, these masterclasses, the idea of the masterclasses was brought into being. I will now request Navan to start asking people who want to ask questions to join us. And yes, Dr. Gill, if you will take questions, or you want to take a quick break or
No,
something. No.
we're good. We can take questions. I just want to quickly say that on the screen, you'll see some further readings,
Okay.
on topic, in addition to the article that I already mentioned, which includes all the readings on masculinity in India. Here's some further readings of books that are not related to India, but just more broadly talks about patriarchy and masculinity. As I said, my work is in relationship with other communities of scholars, of people who are working on this. So I'm certainly not the only person. So I really want you to point everybody to that direction, to go and check out some of these readings, because they have informed my work. And then lastly, my website, which is harjantgill.com, you'll find my writings and my films and more information about my upcoming book on that as well. So I will stop there, and I'll stop my screen share and then we can take on questions.
Yeah. So we are opening the floor to Q&A now. We would like you to post your questions on the chat box, or either if you want, raise your hands. We'll one by one take questions. You can ask them yourself to Dr. Gill. And meanwhile, also, I'll be sharing a feedback form of this masterclass. Please try and fill it. It won't take much time. So yes. We'll wait for a few seconds just in case people are typing in questions. Meanwhile, yeah, if anyone has questions, direct questions, please switch on your cameras, unmute yourself, raise your hands. There's a reaction tool there. You can raise your hand there.
Don't be shy. I know the first question is always difficult to
The first is always delayed, yeah. Moreover, I think I'd like to ask one question before people type in. I mean, I myself navigate through violence across the city. Like while I was doing my master's, I had to travel through, take public modes of transport. I mean, I've noticed that a lot of times there are standers when the violence is happening, and there's a obvious difference between how bystanders look at violence happening to a woman and to a gender non-conforming person who is visibly queer. So my question to you is, have you come across any of these in your research, or how do you look at this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have looked at violence taking place, violence against queer folks. In fact, there's two chapters in my book. One is on, story of an individual who transitioned from female to male, and his story is very instructive in the way in which we think about masculinity, and and then there's a story of a man who lives in Punjab who is a Gidda performer, like kind of a troupe, forms as in kind of female clothing as a cross dresser and has a troupe of and is very popular and very famous, right? And has a big following. And what I'll say is that, and things maybe have changed more, but when I was growing up, I noticed, at least my understanding was that this idea of kind of every homophobic, in the moment homophobic violence, right? Like this kind of apathetic violence, this sense of like repudiation that I see somebody who is gender nonconforming and it evokes in me so much anger because it challenges who I am, is more common in a country like United States than it is in India, right? In India, you'll see, of course, there's kind of policing that happens of, what you wear and how you behave, but there's actually more tolerance for variation in gender presentation. And often, people will ask you things that are that feels personal or that feel invasive, but the real violence that you see that happens against queer people is at the level of the family, right? Because queerness or queer people challenge the kind of heteronormative patriarchal family. And it's okay, it's homosexuality is far more tolerated as kind of, and the act of homosexuality is far more tolerated historically too, or gender variation is far more tolerated in a country like in a country like India than in the United States, as long as it doesn't interfere in that person then going on to marrying, or that person, so for instance, in Indian society, hijras who challenge the notion of gender are expected to leave, family altogether and form their alternative family where there's no option for them to get married. Right? They cannot participate in heteronormative patriarchal kinship, right? They have to come up with an alternative kinship model. So yes, I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't violence, everyday violence, but well, in my experience, the everyday violence against queer people in the US historically has been far more severe, right? Beating somebody to death because you don't like the way they looked at you, or because, it's far more severe than in India. In India, very rarely you'll get beaten to death because you're gay in a community. It's only when, the person that you're in love with says, I don't want to get married anymore. I don't want to marry a woman. I'm going to marry a man. That like family really lose their shit and, start thinking about, killing their own children. Right. And this was very instructive in the story that I was just telling you of a young trans man who, when he identified as a woman, tried to marry his girlfriend as a lesbian, was forcefully separated, thrown in jail, was subjected to a lot of violence. And then over the course of 10 years, he transitioned. He moved to Delhi. He transitioned to becoming a man And then he went back to his family, and the family, once they saw that he's now a man, they fully accepted him. They're like, okay, we now accept you because you to us are presenting as a man. And then eventually he was even able to get married to his girlfriend 10, 20, like 15 years later, right? And the family acquiesced. They were present at the marriage. They were perfectly fine. The issue then became was when it was time for family inheritance, because he has an elder brother, and the elder brother's like, no, I'm supposed to inherit all the property. You were born as a girl. You should not get any property, right? And then now there's a kind of legal battle for inheritance. Who gets the property, whether it's, and the family members are like, well, now he's a man, so he's married. He's man and he's married. He's fulfilled the rite of passage into manhood, so he should get half the property. He's so that kind of complicates. And again, I think one thing we have to think about is that the way in which patriarchy implicates these kind of notions of inheritance and power as well. So I hope that answers your
question. Gill, I'm sure there are lots of other questions also which are now in the chat box as well.
The second question is from Mahira Imam. She says it was a great session. So can you please throw some light on gender-based violence, which is happening through cyberspace, and basically which is happening on cyberspace, basically technology-induced gender-based violence?
So I haven't done a whole lot of research on technology-based gender-based violence, technology-induced gender-based violence. I do think that technology or social media in many ways, I think as an anthropologist, I am not willing to say, like, write off one thing entirely over another. So on one hand, social media has been really important in the experiences of young queer people I meet, because many of them has provided them with a sense of community, to be able to, like a person in, like, I don't know, like rural Minnesota or rural Wisconsin or Kansas can sit there, log on to the internet and log on to YouTube and watch somebody else's transition, In fact, even in India, what's social media has played a very huge role. It's been amazing to see the shift in just the language that people use in identifying and identity categories. Like, we're much more aware of trans issues. We're much more aware of transition. We're much in India, but at the same time, it has also allowed for a particular forms of very egregious forms of violence to be kind of voiced, right? And whether it's on Twitter or on Reddit. And in fact, there's a journalist named Talia Levin who has done an ethnography on these sort of incel groups of young men who meet online because they feel aggrieved. They feel like they've been victimized by patriarchy. They've been left out, and they've been victimized by the feminist movement, and therefore, they've been left out of the equation. And they, so these are the kind of young men who go on these violent rampages. So you might want to check out Talia Levin's book, Culture of Warlords, for more information on that. But I myself haven't done a ton of research on that.
Okay. Question from Christianis. They say eventually control over families pass on from father to son, even when the older father is still alive. I have noticed. I wanted to know if you have noticed which factors facilitate this transfer of power, what accomplishments or life events need to have occurred before this happens. Do men also turn against the older patriarchs eventually in terms of violence?
Oh, absolutely. I think in traditional Punjabi families, the kind of precursor to assuming that patriarchal power is getting married and having children, right? And you see that reinforced in social media. You see that reinforced in stories. You see that reinforced in films. In fact, I recently, so my other interest is popular culture. So I recently wrote an article, which in the process of being published on a new Punjabi film that came out. It's on Amazon Prime. The film is called Gode Gode Cha, and it's a film. It's sort of presented as kind of this feminist film from rural Punjab where women, challenge patriarchal authority. However, it's quite problematic and it's very limiting in that approach. But one of the things that we see in this movie, Gode Gode Cha, is that there's a big Punjabi Jatt family, and the grandfather, who reminds me of my grandfather, treats his eldest son with such disdain because his eldest son decided to pursue education and became a veterinarian, and and decided to and in the process he kind of he didn't get married, and then now he's in the film, now he's too old to get married, right? Like, so he never fulfilled his responsibility. So as a result, the responsibility of taking care of the household then falls on his younger son, right? And he's treated with such apathy, such disdain, he's belittled so terribly, even by the younger men in the family, right? So just for that reason, I would encourage you to watch that movie, because you see the way in which if older men don't, get married and don't have kids, they're treated almost as an outcast. They're literally, I mean, in the film, he literally has to live and occupy a room that's on the outskirts of the house. He cannot be part of the house, right? And he's a veterinarian, and his father keeps insulting him, and he said, "Tu dangara nu hath landa." I mean, which means that in Punjabi we sort of say, all you do is the fondling cows and cattle all day long. Like your life is worth nothing because you haven't gotten married. And to me, it sounded like a lot of the rhetoric that my grandfather used towards me when I decided, or when I resisted his decision to get me married, right? And then to answer your second question about, do men also turn against older patriarchs eventually in terms of violence, that happens all the time, all the time. And again, another wonderful film, which I talk about in the same article, is a film, old film, based on Gurdial Singh's novel called Mari Da Diva, which came out, in the 1980s, I think. And in that, you see, a relationship of a landed patriarch who's a kind of a benevolent patriarch, and how over the course of the film he's deposed from his position of power by his son, who's kind of an asshole, right? Like the benevolent patriarch wants everybody to have their share, but his son is very conniving, and he ends up sort of deposing him, and you sort of see the elderly figure saunter away in the darkness, never to return again, right? So we see that all the time. The films are called Mari Da Diva, Lamp of a Tombstone, and then the other film is called Gode Gode Cha. And I think those two films can be watched, together to be able to kind of get a sense of that, answer that question for you.
Okay, we have Preeti Gopal Krishnan who wants to ask a question. Preeti, could you unmute yourself and you could go ahead?
Good evening, Dr. Gill. Thank you for this interesting session. My question is about how do you think class impacts the access of these men who are sent away or who would like to go away? How does class impact their ability to go away indeed? So do you think that only a certain section of these people can actually go away? Simple question.
That's a great question, and certainly, when we think about migrations from Punjab, what's interesting is that you do have the dominant caste or class Jatt men who are able to access transnational migration in ways that non-landed, non-Jatts can, and in fact, many non-Jatts and kind of landed men will go to the Middle East, or they'll go to countries where there isn't kind of path to security. One of the other ways in which, I find gender migration to really reconfigure gender roles is the way in which the family's wealth is used to help young men to migrate who cannot go on their own. So, for instance, you'll have there's numerous stories of young men who themselves are not exactly they're not academically inclined, or they're not studious, or they can't clear their IELTS exam, right? Or they cannot get a job. So what happens is that families will then find a girl, usually of a slightly lower class family, what we call in Punjabi the garib ghar di ladki, like from a poor family or a less well-off family, and then they'll say, okay, we will sponsor her migration. We will sponsor the family. The boy's family will pay for her education. They'll pay for her IELTS exams. They will pay for her to go abroad. In exchange, she has to marry their son and then sponsor his visa, and then eventually sponsor the visa of the entire family, right? So again,
Right.
I think what's interesting is that the way in which people use, family wealth, land wealth as a way to mobilize migrations, even the female migrations. And you'll hear these, you hear these really interesting stories of Punjabi families over-educating their daughters, right? Like, it's like, what the hell does that
Right.
mean? Right?
Right.
They're over-educating their
Right.
daughters so that they can become more attractive marital prospects in this kind of transnational migration journeys. And again,
Yeah.
that's to facilitate the migration of young men, right? They become the vessels for men to move, so again, reinforcing a kind of patriarchal structure, that's not really liberating for them, at least.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Gill.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Gill. So there's one more question though. It's from Chanda Asani. She's from Department of Women's Studies, where MA Gender Studies is taught. Since you said Punjabi men migrate to move away from patriarchy, then can violence be accepted as norm of patriarchy?
So I want to correct myself. I said that's amongst the myriad of reasons, right? So, migration is much more complicated and far longer. What I'm trying to do is to think about the role patriarchy plays as one of the ways in which young men make the decision to go away, right? And that does not necessarily mean that again, for me, this has been a very different story because moving to California, moving to Washington D.C. eventually allowed me to be able to live my life as an openly gay man, not have the pressure to get married. And when my grandfather did try to get me married, he put the what's it called, classified ad in the newspaper. All I had to do was basically be like, okay, fine, I'm going back to the US. I'm not going to deal with this anymore. I just got on the plane and came back, right? So yes, there's a kind of migration away. But even for a lot of young men who do go abroad, often they find that diasporic communities can be just as patriarchal, just as casteist, just as oppressive as those back home, right? When you become part of the diasporic community, those same gender hierarchies are reinforced, and often reinforced with a much more militant zeal, right? And there's violence even in diaspora. You hear stories of women being abused quite badly. In fact, sorry, I keep referring to movies, but I love, I'm a visual anthropologist, so I love watching and talking about movies. But I think a really good movie to watch that deals with this in a much more interesting way is Deepa Mehta's 2010 film Videsh, Heaven on Earth. It's kind of hard to track down, but if you can find a copy of it, it's an excellent film because it shows you, a story of a Punjabi family living in Canada and young bride who's being sent abroad, and it's a working class family where everybody's struggling, and yet it's the young bride who's played by Preeti Zinta. She's the one who's subjected to most amounts of violence, right? And it's actually the mother-in-law, her mother-in-law, the mother of the son who married her and brought her over, who mobilizes that violence, right? Who tells her son, that your wife doesn't know how to make round chapatis, therefore you should beat her, and she's beaten incessantly and mercilessly in this Canadian Punjabi family, and she has no way to kind of get out of it, right? Because there's a kind of expectation that then she would sponsor her brother, and if she left, then they would lose all the dowry that they had paid for this wedding. So, this violence is then transnationalized, right? It's not just in India you see this forms of violence.
Yes, we take the last question of the day. We have Pratishi Hazarika. She says, "Sir, you notice any shifts in terms of acceptance of queer men in the recent times, or do the challenges remain the same?"
Within India or within Punjab, in urban areas there is more acceptance, right? And there's more awareness now. And I think that it's sort of circumstantial, right? So one of the ways in which now there's more awareness is you have these stories, these really sensational stories of young queer men being forced by their families to marry women, and then the women, their wives, find out, and then the wives then accuse their husbands of committing or having betrayed them, right? And then there was a very sensational story where I think the wife committed suicide when she found it. She discovered her husband's queerness and his infidelity, right? And then that's a really unfortunate story that you hear. And in fact, a lot of young men, in Punjab who are queer, they're forced into these heterosexual marriages, and then they go on to have like extramarital affairs. Instead of having extramarital affairs with women, they have extramarital affairs with men. You go to rural Punjab and turn on Grindr, you'll see so many men on there, and they all identify as straight, but they're hooking up with other men. And because of social media and because of digital media, now there's more awareness of it. So there's more caution. A lot of young men will say, "I'd rather stay unmarried than ruin, quote unquote, ruin a girl's life," right? So I think that's one interesting way in which we're beginning to have this conversation. But then also, there's a story of a young man I document in my book who comes from a very religious family in Ludhiana, and he's actually also in the film. And he started out as kind of a straight male, and his parents were very upset that he had cut his hair and rejected his religion. And then eventually he migrated abroad, and then he came out as queer and is now living with his boyfriend, who's also Punjabi, in Canada. And his parents have somehow found a way to accept him and his boyfriend. Meanwhile, his elder brother married a woman of a lower caste, and they're still estranged to his elder brother who engaged in intercaste marriage. So there's all these interesting stories that you find, and there's no kind of clear way to delineate whether this is progressive. This is, on one hand, you've got these parents that accept their queer son and his boyfriend, but they are still rejecting their elder son who they disowned because he married somebody of a lower caste, right? So, it's more complicated. So, but I think there's more awareness. There's a lot of language, and I think social media has, and even films have done a really good job. This new show called Kohra that came out on Netflix has done a really good job of even just starting the conversation of queerness within Punjab, because that's one of the major stories in the film.
Yes, Dr. Gill, we wanted to ask you whether you will be. I know we've kind of completely run out of time, but would you be willing to take a few more questions, or you want to call it a wrap? We want to ask your permission before we go ahead. We can take a couple of more questions, huh?
Yeah,
I just wanted to ask your permission before we do that.
Yeah.
All right. So Navan, please facilitate the next question.
Yes. We have Anjali here who has a question. How have societal norms contributed to the prevalence and perpetuation of hegemonic masculinity over time? I repeat, how have societal norms contributed to the prevalence and perpetuation of hegemonic masculinity over time?
One of the primary ways in which that I see that we keep patriarchal structure intact and in place is through the ways in which men acquire certain power, and when I'm talking about not just political power, but also in terms of economic power through these patriarchal structures, right? In Punjab, what that means is even though Punjab government and the Indian government has changed inheritance laws, property and wealth and family, everything is inherited and passed down from fathers to son, land inheritance, right? And that's a kind of that practice of primogeniture dates back to feudal times, feudalism, right? And so to hang on to that notion of kind of feudal practice of primogeniture, of passing on property to their sons, women are completely disempowered in this situation when they have no land, they have no property, they have no, rights outside of the relationship that they have with their husbands and their husbands' families, right? So I think that has perpetuated, son preference, that has perpetuated hegemonic masculinity, that has perpetuated patriarchy, right? And also the need to kind of maintain this power structure. So one thing that we can do, I think one thing that all Punjabi parents can do is start just like in the US, start drawing wills, right? Or which equally divides their property amongst all their children, right? Because it's not like your son, even though they think that their sons are going to take care of them, let's be honest, most sons, they treat them poorly at the end of their lives. In many cases in Punjab these days, sons are not even around, they're all abroad. So they're being taken, the elderly parents, the mothers and fathers are being taken care of by their daughters, who are married and live in a different village, right? So many of the sons are not even there. They're not even fulfilling those kind of expectations, those patriarchal expectations. So why is it that we're so committed to this idea that all the property, like my mother's side of the family, we come from a very landed family. There are 5 sisters and 3 brothers. And the 3 brothers inherited all of the property, right? All the land. And my mother and her sisters got nothing, maybe they got something in dowry, but even the dowry is then passed on to their, in-laws family, their affinal kin. It's not actually held on to the mothers, or the wives. So one of the ways in which we can sort of rethink that, and even though, as I said, I've looked at these cases, even though laws have changed, women are not making claims to their ancestral land. Women are not making claims. The ones who are then socially shunned, or they are, treated very poorly, or they're they're excommunicated from their families, or their kinship network stop communicating with them. Right now, what's interesting is that there has been cases where some women, including in my own family, some women have used the threat of lawsuit, the threat of wanting to claim their ancestral property, as a way to get their brothers to do things that that they were not going to do, but they have never actually carried through with that legal litigation to claim their ancestral property. Right, so. Until we don't sort of figure out, and until we don't give women economic power and power over their own lives, we cannot really deal with patriarchy or solve the issue of patriarchy, right? I think the other part of it is, thinking about violence, right? I'm increasingly thinking more and more, if violence is the norm in patriarchy, how do you come up with how do you sort of maintain what is a feminist stance against patriarchy looks like, right? Like what does it mean to be a feminist individual, who resist the power of patriarchy? And I'm not the only man. There are plenty of men in my community, including my twin brother, who is heterosexual. He's straight. He married a woman, decided not to have kids. Like again, challenged patriarchal norms in that way, and is perfectly fine with his wife earning more money than he is. He does not feel insecure as a man. He does not feel the need to exercise his power through violence, right? So I think one of the ways in which we need to start thinking about is how do we stop enacting violence, even in our kind of sort of everyday discourse, the way we talk about, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਬੰਦਾ ਬਣਾਉਣਾ ਹੈ, like let's straighten him out by beating him up, right? Like let's, this threat of violence that is very pervasive, especially now, it's growing more and more. And what's actually has led me to is to start thinking about how do we reincorporate the values of nonviolence into our everyday practice, right? I'm not somebody who has studied Gandhi in any kind of detailed way or looked at nonviolence movements in the history of our country or even the US with MLK. But maybe these people, who we've sort of dismissed had something that they knew that we, didn't think about. Maybe a kind of a non-violent masculinity or non-violence approach to non-violence is what we need, if we're to think about gender justice in this world, to kind of move towards equity, because it's not just about violence that men enact on other women, but it's also men enact on themselves and each other, right? I don't think, one of the things that I find over and over again is that most men are actually quite miserable living in patriarchal structures. They think that they're empowered, but they're quite miserable. And if you watch the movie The Animal, again, I keep coming back to that film, like you just feel sorry for the guy because he's just so miserable. He wants to no longer be in this position of power, and the only way he can think of getting out of it is by enacting violence onto everybody else, right? And so that's my sort of thinking. It's that maybe we need to start thinking about nonviolent movement and reincorporating that into our kind of feminist practice, right?
I wanted to come in here and ask you one question. There is, as toxic masculinity is on the rise, and we also see on one side, sociopolitically, the far right has also been growing stronger and stronger. So do you see both these things connected? The rise of fascism and the rise of this whole playing with identity politics and sort of otherizing entire communities, all that hatred, the politics of hatred that we see on the rise, that and the rise of toxic masculinity, both these things, do you see any connection between them?
Of course, I think that connection is becoming more evident now than ever before, right? So we know that throughout history, people who are despots, people who are, who are like the rulers, or people who have sought to control other people who are,
dictators.
Dictators, thank you. Dictator is the word that I'm looking for. They have maintained that control through power or through violence, right? And it's only through violence that you can sort of rise to the top of the patriarchal pyramid. Look at somebody like Putin. He was able to climb to the top of dictatorship, at the top of power. But in order for him to stay in that position of power, he's carrying out mass violence against an entire country. Like they just bombed a children's hospital 2 days ago, in Ukraine, right? And the only reason why that violence is being enacted, only reason why all these Russian men are going into Ukraine and, killing people is because the need for this one man to stay in a position of power, right? And and being in that top of the position is actually a very lonely position to be. I mean, I do not want to live like Vladimir Putin. Can you imagine, living your entire life constantly being afraid that somebody's going to come and overthrow you, or somebody's going to poison you, or somebody's going to kill you, somebody's going to, like, it is a paranoid and scary place to be on top of that position of power, right? And we see a similar move and similar mobilization of violence within India that's also happening, right? But you cannot sustain that for very long. I mean, for how long can you genocide people or kill people until even the people who are doing the acts of violence get tired and say, okay, enough is enough. And then what happens to you afterwards in the long run, right? And there's a wonderful essay that I read by Paramita Vora, the filmmaker, amazing, incredible filmmaker, and it's called A Different Masculinity, right? And she talks about, in this article, she talks about Rahul Gandhi, who's an interesting figure, and his kind of effete, what the right likes to call his effete masculinity, right? His sort of the kind of non-violent kind of masculinity, where he's doing this sort of yatra and making fun of it, ridiculing it, right? In the same way that you would ridicule a queer person in school, in the same way you would ridicule, a gender non-conforming person, right? So, and I recommend that you read that article, because what it tells you is that the right wing, or the BJP in this, is very afraid of it. They're scared that they need to mobilize such violence and violent rhetoric to control somebody who is seen as effete and who is seen as nonviolence, because that position of nonviolence is a kind of radical position in the long run. It might not seem like on the surface. And again and again, I mean, even throughout the I mean, I looked at history of Sikhs and history of Punjab. I think, and again, you have these moments of like violent encounters and violence, and we sort of valorize these religious figures, these warriors, these martyrs, but it has not really resulted in a society that's functioning and normal and is happy and is content and is fulfilling, right? I find myself turning to the teachings of Guru Nanak, who was more on the side of nonviolence, practicing nonviolence and forgiveness, than some of the kind of more religious fundamentalism that we see. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have the answer, and I certainly a lot of this is new territory for me, but I'm trying to figure this out. And so, but I do feel that there's a kind of conviction in me that, like, for me, a feminist position or feminist masculinity is one that is a non-violent masculinity that rejects forms of violence, which is hard to do when you grew up being surrounded by it, right? And that's something my partner, who's American, he's like, why are you always punching people? Or are you so like, what is your impulse to like kick somebody or like, threaten them with violence? It's because we grew up surrounded by it. We're always being beaten, kicked, and we need to stop that.
So that was Dr. Gill. When you have a person of with that kind of standing and understanding of gender, of masculinity, you feel like you can keep him there all night and still we will not run out of questions to ask. But for reasons of being practical, we'll have to end it there. We will have to. I want to thank Dr. Harjant Gill for making time to be part of this masterclass and joining us, giving us so much of his precious time. And it was really like the India time, and his time was very different. So which is why I want to thank him once again for making those adjustments and bearing with us. Anyone, I'm sure there are lots of people who want to still ask you questions and want to interact with you. So you have announced your harjantgill.com, your website. They can reach out to you on the website and communicate with you. And if you want, you can put out an email address or something which they can maybe communicate with you with. So I feel the this has been a really great session. I like the stories that you touched upon. And the best thing about this lecture has been that whenever you spoke of any issue, any of facet of or the contour of this problem, you always humanized it. You brought a real life person into the picture, and that was one of the special things about this lecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Gill, once again on behalf of all of us who've joined this masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you, Navin, Yogesh, Ankita, and Population First for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. This was an absolute pleasure, and I could have talked a lot longer, but I recognize, we have time is limited, and I thank you for the opportunity. And yes, please be in touch. My email is in the chat, and my website is there. It's sorry, my website is harjantgill.com. I think I wrote it incorrectly, so let me just.
No, I corrected it actually.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Very.
Yeah, it was great actually listening to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gill, and hope to working with you in future or seeing you talk somewhere.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation.